Imagine a man who stood 6'2" in an era of giants, riding a massive white stallion through the lawless Indian territory of the 1870s. He carried two Colt .45 revolvers, handles facing forward for a lightning-fast cross-draw, and a Winchester rifle he could fire with surgical precision. Over his 32-year career, he arrested more than 3,000 outlaws, killed 14 in self-defense, and was never once wounded. But here is the most shocking part. He began his life as a slave, escaped into the wilderness, and became the first black U.S. deputy marshal west of the Mississippi. This is not a tall tale. This is the recorded history of the man who out-hustled the Wild West. Chapter 1. The Chains of the Cotton Field. The sun over Texas was a physical weight, a hammer of heat that forged men into steel or broke them into dust. Bass was born into the latter category, or so his masters thought. Born in Crawford County, Arkansas, he was property before he was a person. Young Bass was observant. While other boys played, he watched the way the wind moved through the tall grass and the way the colonel handled his firearms. He learned the language of the lead before he learned to read a single letter of the English alphabet. When the Civil War broke out, his master, George Reeves, took Bass to the front lines as a body servant. But history changed during a game of cards. A dispute over a hand led to Bass striking George, an act that meant certain death for a slave. Under the cover of a moonless night, Bass fled into the most dangerous place on the continent, the Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. Chapter 2. The Red Man's Discipline. For years, Bass lived among the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole nations. This is where the history textbooks usually skip the details, but this is where the legend was sharpened. Bass didn't just hide, he adapted. He learned the nuances of 5 different indigenous languages. He learned to track a horse by the way a single blade of grass was bent, and how to survive on nothing but parched corn and grit. Most importantly, he perfected his marksmanship. By the time the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, Bass Reeves wasn't just a free man, he was a ghost of the plains, a master of a land where the U.S. government had no eyes. Chapter 3. The Badge and the Bible. In 1875, hanging Judge Isaac Parker was appointed to the Western District of Arkansas. The territory was a cesspool of murderers, horse thieves, and whiskey runners. Parker needed 200 deputies who were brave enough to go into the land of the dead and bring back the monsters. James Fagan, the U.S. Marshal, knew only one man who could navigate the tribal lands and outshoot any outlaw. He pinned a silver star on Bass Reeves' chest. Bass was illiterate. He couldn't read the warrants he carried. Every morning he would have someone read the names of the fugitives to him. He would memorize the sounds of the names and the crimes associated with them. He never brought back the wrong man. Chapter 4. The Master of Disguise. What made Bass truly extraordinary to a modern audience was his wit. He was a pioneer of undercover work. Once, looking for 2 notorious brothers, he dressed as a tattered tramp, wore an old pair of shoes with the soles cut out, and walked 28 miles to their mother's house. He pretended the law was chasing him. The mother took him in, fed him, and when the outlaws arrived, they felt so safe they fell asleep. Bass handcuffed them both in their beds without firing a single shot. Chapter 5. The Ultimate Sacrifice. The most heartbreaking and real part of Bass's story occurred when a warrant was issued for a murderer in the territory. The name on the paper? Benny Reeves, his own son. Other marshals offered to take the warrant to spare Bass the pain. Bass refused. "The law is the law," he said. He tracked his own son, arrested him, and turned him over to the court. Benny served 11 years in Leavenworth. It was the ultimate testament to the man's unshakable moral compass.
Chapter 6. The Ghost of the Washita. The year was 1884, and the air in the Indian Territory tasted of dry pine and impending blood. Bass Reeves sat atop his gray stallion, a beast as tireless as its rider. In his saddlebag lay a stack of warrants, parchment that most men in these parts used for kindling, but which Bass treated as holy scripture. Among those papers was a name that made even the bravest marshals in Fort Smith develop a sudden fever: Jim Webb. Webb was a foreman at the Washington McClish Ranch, a man who had killed an innocent neighbor over a grazing dispute and then retreated into the labyrinth of the brush, surrounded by a private army of loyal, well-armed cowhands. Bass didn't ride in with a posse. He rode in with a single scout, a man named Floyd Wilson. As they approached the ranch, the tension was a physical cord stretched tight across the horizon. Suddenly, the crack of a Winchester shattered the silence. A puff of smoke rose from a ridge 300 yards away. Bass didn't flinch. He simply calculated the trajectory. "Stay back, Floyd," Bass rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "This man's debt is to the government, and I'm the collector." What followed was a tactical masterclass. Webb, thinking he had the advantage of height, fired again. The bullet grazed the brim of Bass's hat. Most men would have dived for cover. Bass, however, spurred his horse forward. He understood the psychology of the outlaw. They expected fear. When you gave them relentless forward motion instead, their aim faltered. Bass leapt from his horse while it was still at a gallop, rolling into the tall blue-stem grass. Webb lost sight of him. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the wind. Then, from a position Webb never expected, Bass emerged. "Jim Webb," Bass shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I have a warrant for your soul. Drop the rifle or meet your maker." Webb spun, firing wildly. Bass raised his Winchester. One shot. The outlaw's rifle was shattered in his hands. A second shot. The Webb's revolver flew from his belt. The third shot pierced Webb's chest. As Webb lay dying in the red dirt, he looked up at the towering black man standing over him. He unbuckled his own gun belt, a beautiful silver-studded piece of leather, and handed it to Bass. "I thought I was the fastest," Webb whispered, coughing blood. "Take this. You're the only man alive fit to wear it." Bass took the belt, but he didn't smile. He knelt, pulled a small Bible from his coat, and read a prayer over the man he had just killed. He took no pleasure in the death, only in the restoration of the balance. Chapter 7. The Trial of the Lawman. But the life of a black marshal in a post-Reconstruction America was a tightrope walk over a pit of vipers. In 1887, the very system Bass served turned its fangs on him. Bass was accused of murdering his camp cook, a man named William Leach. The charge was first-degree murder. To his enemies, the white supremacists who hated seeing a black man with a badge, and the outlaws who wanted him dead, this was the moment they had waited for. Bass was stripped of his badge. He went from the hunter to the hunted, locked in a cell in the very jail where he had delivered thousands of prisoners. The irony was a bitter pill. For months he sat in the dark, listening to the taunts of men he had arrested. "Where's your star now, Bass?" they'd jeer. "The rope is waiting for you." The trial was a sensation. It was held in the court of Judge Isaac Parker, the hanging judge himself. Parker was a hard man, but he was a fair one. He watched as witness after witness tried to smear Bass's reputation. But then Bass took the stand. He didn't beg. He spoke with the quiet dignity of a man who had stared down death in every creek and canyon of the territory. He explained that the shooting was a tragic accident, a discharge of a firearm while cleaning it in camp. He showed the jury his hands, calloused, scarred, yet steady. The jury, composed mostly of white men in a deeply segregated era, deliberated for hours. When they returned, the verdict was not guilty. Bass walked out of that courtroom, went straight to the marshal's office, and asked for his badge back. He had 20 more years of work to do. Chapter 8. The Queen of the Outlaws. No story of the American West is complete without Belle Starr, the bandit queen. She was sophisticated, dangerous, and ran a criminal empire from her stronghold at Younger's Bend. Many marshals were terrified of Belle, not just because of her gun, but because of her political connections. But Bass Reeves didn't care about politics. When a warrant was issued for her horse theft ring, Bass rode straight into her camp. Legend says Belle Starr saw him coming and told her men to stand down. "That's Bass Reeves," she reportedly said. "If you shoot and miss, you're dead. If you shoot and hit, his ghost will still come back to handcuff you." She surrendered to him personally, allegedly charmed by his manners. Bass treated her with the same formal respect he gave a schoolteacher, escorting her to Fort Smith without a single hand being laid upon her. It was this combination of lethal skill and unshakable chivalry that made him a folk hero among the very people he arrested. Chapter 9. The Irony of the Lone Ranger. As the 1890s bled into the 1900s, the Wild West was being tamed by the railroad and the telegraph. Bass was getting older, his hair turning the color of the Oklahoma dust. Yet his reputation had grown to mythic proportions. He started wearing a disguise more often. He would dress as a farmer, a cowboy, or even a preacher to get close to his targets. He often rode a lead gray or white horse. He was known for handing out silver keepsakes, not silver bullets, but small tokens of his presence. Historians today point to these facts as the origin of the Lone Ranger. The radio show and later the TV series featured a masked man on a white horse who left silver bullets and had a Native American companion, similar to Bass's many indigenous scouts. But in the 1930s, a black hero wouldn't sell to a national audience, so the legend was whitewashed. Bass Reeves didn't care about the credit. He cared about the 3,000 warrants he had served. He cared about the fact that in 32 years he had never been hit by an outlaw's bullet, though his hat and coat were riddled with holes. The final stand, the Muskogee years. In 1907, Oklahoma became a state. With statehood came Jim Crow laws. The federal marshal system was dismantled in favor of local police forces. Bass, now almost 70, was told he was too old and the wrong color to be a state official. But the city of Muskogee knew better. They hired him as a simple patrolman. For 2 years, the greatest lawman in American history walked a beat on the city streets. During his time on the force, it was reported that not a single crime was committed on his beat. The mere sight of the old man with the twin Colts and the piercing eyes was enough to keep the peace. Bass Reeves died in 1910 of Bright's disease. His funeral was attended by hundreds, black, white, and indigenous. They buried him in an unmarked grave to prevent outlaws from desecrating his body. To this day, the exact location of his resting place is a secret kept by the earth he spent his life protecting.
Chapter 6. The Merchant of Shadows. New York City in February 1780 was a jagged graveyard of masts and ice. The East River was a solid sheet of white, and the British Army had burned almost every fence and abandoned building in the city just to keep their barracks warm. Robert Townsend stood behind the counter of his dry goods store on Peck Slip. He was a man of modest appearance, the kind of man you see 1,000 times and never truly remember. This was his greatest weapon. The bell above the door chimed, cutting through the silence of the frost. In walked Colonel John Graves Simcoe, the commander of the Queen's Rangers. Simcoe was a man who smelled of expensive tobacco and arrogance. "Townsend," Simcoe barked, slapping a pair of leather gloves onto the counter. "I need fine wool, the best you have, and I need it by sunset. We march tomorrow." Robert bowed slightly, his face a mask of polite servitude. "Tomorrow, Colonel? In this weather? The drifts are 10 feet high near Kingsbridge." Simcoe leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The drifts don't matter when the river is a highway, man. We're crossing the ice at night. We'll be in the rebels' kitchen at Morristown before they can light a signal fire. Now, the wool." The dead drop. As Simcoe turned to inspect a crate of tea, Robert's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. The winter strike Simcoe mentioned was exactly what Washington feared. Robert didn't reach for a musket, he reached for a ledger. As he measured the wool, he surreptitiously slipped a tiny pre-written note on the stain paper into the pocket of his waistcoat. He needed to get this to Austin Rowe, the Ring's long-distance courier, who was waiting at a tavern 3 blocks away. But there was a problem. A British sentry was stationed at the tavern's door, checking every man's papers. The Great Frost had made the British paranoid. They knew spies were crawling through the city like lice. The coffee house gambit. Robert closed his shop early, complaining of a rheumatic chill. He walked toward Rivington's Coffee House, a well-known haunt for British officers. Inside, the heat was stifling. James Rivington, the King's printer, and, unknown to almost everyone, another secret member of the Ring, was holding court. Robert sat in a corner, ordered a dish of coffee, and waited. He saw his contact, a woman known only as 355. She was a socialite, draped in furs, laughing at the joke of a British major. She was the one who could move through the city without being searched. As she passed Robert's table, she accidentally dropped her silk handkerchief. Robert stood, retrieved it, and handed it back with a polite nod. "You dropped this, madam." "Thank you, kind sir," she replied, her eyes meeting his for a fraction of a second. Inside the folds of that silk handkerchief was the location of the British heavy artillery on the ice. Robert had just passed the death warrant for Simcoe's surprise attack. Chapter 7. The Midnight Ride on Ice. The message now had to travel 150 miles through enemy lines, across the frozen Sound, and into Washington's hands. Austin Rowe took the message from 355 outside the city limits. He didn't ride on the roads, the British patrols were too thick. Instead, he took his horse onto the Long Island Sound. The ice groaned beneath the horse's hooves. It was a sound like a cannon firing, echoing for miles in the dead of night. Every crack was a heartbeat. If the ice gave way, Rowe and the secrets of the Revolution would be swallowed by the Black Atlantic. The physics of the ice. The thickness of the ice needed to support a horse and rider, W, is governed by the formula for the bearing capacity of ice. W equals A times D squared. In 1780, the ice was nearly 20 inches thick, enough for a small army, but brittle enough to be a death trap if hit in the wrong spot. Rowe reached the boatman, Caleb Buster, at the Hidden Cove. Buster's whaleboat was mounted on wooden runners, effectively a sled with a sail. "The wind is from the north," he whispered, his breath a cloud of frost. "We'll be across the Sound in an hour. Tell Washington the ghost is coming." Chapter 8. The Rose and the Raven. While the men froze in the trenches of Morristown, the war in New York City moved to the ballroom of the Kennedy House at No. 1 Broadway, the headquarters of British Commander-in-Chief Henry Clinton. Agent 355 stood near the punch bowl, her silk gown a sharp contrast to the grim reality of the starving city outside. She was a loyalist socialite by day, a favorite of the British High Command. They saw her as a pretty ornament. She saw them as a collection of loose lips and overconfident egos. She wasn't looking for troop movements tonight.
She was looking for a ghost. Talmadge's last message was clear. A high-ranking American officer is selling the Highlands. Find the buyer. The slip of the tongue. Major John Andre, the dashing head of British intelligence, was the raven of the New York social scene. He was charming, poetic, and dangerously observant. 355 watched him glide through the room, eventually stopping to whisper to a man in a dark civilian coat. She moved closer, pretending to adjust her fan. The negotiations with Gustavus are nearly complete. The Gibraltar of America will be ours by the time the ice thaws. 355 froze. Gustavus. It was a code name, and the Gibraltar of America could only mean one place, West Point. If West Point fell, the British would control the Hudson River, cutting New England off from the rest of the colonies. The Revolution would be decapitated in a single stroke. The cryptographic catch. That night, 355 didn't go home. She slipped into a darkened corner of a nearby tavern where Robert Townsend was waiting. Gustavus, she whispered, the name tasting like poison. Andre is talking to someone from the Highlands. He mentioned a price. Townsend scribbled the name down. We need to know who Gustavus is. There are only 5 men with the authority to hand over West Point. It's Arnold, she said, her voice trembling. I saw a letter on Andre's desk earlier this week. It had a signature, a frantic, looped A. It matched the handwriting on a manifest from the Philadelphia occupation. It's Benedict Arnold. The revelation was a physical blow. Arnold was Washington's favorite general. He was the hero of Saratoga. Chapter 9. The Trap is Set. Back at the Continental Army camp, the atmosphere was one of controlled chaos. Washington received the dispatch. He didn't explode in anger. He went silent. The betrayal stung more than the frostbite. He wants to give them the fort, Washington muttered to Talmadge, and he wants to give me. Arnold had invited Washington to breakfast at his headquarters near West Point, planning to have British troops capture the commander-in-chief in his chair. We cannot arrest him yet, Washington decided. If we move too soon, Andre escapes, and the British will simply find another traitor. We wait until the Raven meets the traitor. The confrontation on the neutral ground. The neutral ground, the lawless woods between the two armies, became the stage for the climax. John Andre, disguised in civilian clothes and carrying the plans for West Point in his boot, began his ride back to New York City. He thought he was safe. He thought the great frost had kept the rebels huddled in their huts. But the Culper Ring was everywhere. 3 Skinners, militiamen tipped by a vague warning from the spy network, stopped Andre near Tarrytown. When they searched his boots, the world changed. The aftermath of the frost. The capture of Andre broke the back of the conspiracy. Arnold fled to a British ship, his name forever synonymous with traitor. But the revolution had survived its coldest hour. As the sun began to rise on a late February morning, a sound echoed across the Hudson, a sound louder than any cannon. Crack! The ice was breaking. The great frost was ending. Washington stood on the banks, watching the massive sheets of ice grind against each other as they swept out toward the sea. He turned to Talmadge. The winter is over, Benjamin, and we are still here. Final historical fact. Agent 355 was eventually captured and placed on the HMS Jersey, a brutal British prison ship. She likely died there, never revealing her true name. She gave her life so that a nation could have a name of its own.